folks. We are delighted to see you again. And Seminar 3, we're going to crack forward and try to stop as soon as we can. Great to have you again. As soon as we can, so that we can move on to the discussion, which, as the last two seminars have shown, are infinitely more interesting than the lecture themselves. But what we all want to do, apart from mixed bits, my bits, mixed bits are brilliant. But what we want to do is just go through some of the ideas around change and making this change process happen. Linda Grattan apologised. She has the lurgy. She has flu, as I suspect do several others. But we will have to make do without a chair. So if we get off track, just make a noise and tell us to do something differently. But okay. Anyone know what this is? 1967. Anyone know what's going on?
Probably changing from left to right.
Are you? Yes. Are you from that part of the world? Sweden.
It was Sweden, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. 3 weeks before I was born. Yep. 3 weeks before I was born. Yep. They just did it. And did it work?
Yes.
Absolutely. Piece of cake. They just changed direction. Yeah, all the cars, the wheels were the wrong side, etc. But they did it. It just worked. It just worked. Is climate change going to be yay simple? Well, the need, the opportunity, the technologies to do it. Let's look at the need. You've seen the need. I'm not going to recap this. Let's sum it up in terms of what this means in terms of transformation for business. This is a slide adapted from Tim Jackson. To meet a luxury, easygoing target of 450, the cushy target of 450, we got to go from round about 800 at the moment, 768, down to 36 based on current incomes. In other words, 36 assuming that underdeveloped countries will remain underdeveloped. Or, if you put in some equity into there, down to 9. Down to 9 grams of CO2 per dollar. So that is something of the order of magnitude of what we face. Is it going to be doable? What we looked at last time were really two models and the interplay between them. We looked at Perez and Perez's paths to transformation, which show that there's a critical period between frenzy and synergy, when change either takes root or doesn't and dies. That's the first model. The second model, which we're interweaving with this, is how does that pathway happen? How do you get from frenzy to synergy? And our thesis is that one of the things that comes into play is congruence. That if you can manage to develop congruence simultaneously with two things, with a new external environment, in this case, a carbon-constrained universe, and at the same time, with the political, economic, social, technological, legal, and behavioral forces that shape us and determine business success, then you can drive something from frenzy to synergy. This is a thesis, and what we now want to do is to explore it with some examples of transformations in the past that have succeeded. Mick.
I think one of the things that that can come out of the first two seminars would be that not just the enormity of the challenge, but that it's an overwhelming challenge to transform into whatever this new environment within which business is going to operate. So what we're going to focus on for the first part of the seminar today is that historically transformation has happened. So we're going to look at different examples of transformation and what their relevance is. This is the catalytic converter. It's a very, in some ways, quite revolutionary, but in some ways quite a simple example of a transformation. has essentially introduced the catalytic converter into motor cars, initially in California. And it came about despite the resistance of the automotive industry that said this is too costly, that it's not doable technologically, and it will meet with all sorts of hostility from consumers. The politicians originally had no appetite, but companies like Johnson Matthey, who had the technology to do this, won over the politicians were able to win over the public. Catalytic converters became part of the American automotive industry and subsequently the world automotive industry. And the automotive industry, despite all its arguments that this was economically unfeasible, was able to suck up and pass on the costs. And now there is no question anywhere in the world of having a car without a catalytic converter. This is the age of steam. The age of steam typically portrayed in terms of steam locomotives, but of course it was much more than that. It was about the steam engines that pumped the water out of the coal mines that enabled the Industrial Revolution to be fueled by making coal accessible that hitherto wasn't. It was about steam engines in the textile industry and so on and so forth. Here you have an example in the Perez terms where there was this eruption with the steam technology that alongside the advent of steam you had you didn't necessarily have a favourable financial environment, but you did have a fairly neutral financial environment, a financial environment that was able to adapt to the needs of the new steam entrepreneurs. Politically, it was quite split, certainly in Britain, between the old landed class and the new entrepreneurial industrial class that was emerging. And so that in the space of something like 50 years, you moved from 25 miles of railway track to 165,000 miles of railway track in the world, from something like 2 locomotives, steam locomotives, to 70,000 steam locomotives, all between 1825 and 1875. A very, very rapid growth. But again, steam itself doesn't tell us everything that we need to know about transformation. And so in looking for an example of real transformation where it was more than simply the availability of technology and money, because as we've talked about in earlier seminars, this is not simply a financial and technological problem, the transformation into a resource-constrained economy. And I came across the example of slaves, particularly slaves in the British colonies, although that story then panned out across the world. One of the interesting things about slavery was in the 1690s you had a situation where the Caribbean slave colonies were the most profitable economies in the world for GDP. In 1700s, you had 5 African slaves for every European moving into the New World. Even though the trade was outlawed in the US and Great Britain, in 1807 the trade was still vigorous. 1825, New World plantation was still expanding in area and number, and even by 1850, the Atlantic slave trade, despite the abolition in the US and Great Britain, the slave trade was only 5% down by 1850. 5.5 million New World slaves in 1850. And interestingly, industries growing, new industries emerging, which were accommodating the use of slaves in their new technologies. So questioning the conventional wisdom that slavery was made redundant because of the emergence of new technology. There are many examples where slaves were actually working the new technology. And yet, by 1888, within 70-odd years, less than 70 years, of the abolition of the slave trade, slavery was illegal throughout the Western Hemisphere. What the slavery story really tells us, in some ways, is it's not a technological story. The technology was there were alternatives there, but they were not essential. It's not an economic story. Some people would argue, and this was the conventional wisdom about slavery for much of up until the late 20th century, that it wasn't about economic decline of the slave industry, that there was no longer an economic imperative for slaves and therefore slavery could fade away. People like Drescher make very, very forceful arguments that actually this was a very thriving industry. But the moral will, the activism within society came together, that there was the technology available, that there was pamphleteering, incredibly active women's movement against slavery. In one of the last petitions, major petitions in Britain about slave protesting against slavery, it was 25% of the people that signed the petition were women in a time when they couldn't vote and were much more marginalised in society than even later on in the Victorian period. People were exposed to these images, the stories of the maltreatment of slaves. But what's also going on is that slavery did no longer chime with the emerging revolutionary ideas of free market laissez-faire capitalism. And so, despite the economic arguments, despite the technological arguments, in some ways the ideology spurred that transformation. That was subsequently followed by regulation. This is the abolition of the slave trade. This is the abolition of slavery itself in Britain in 1833. And that is the final one in the Western Hemisphere, the abolition of slavery in Brazil in 1888. And you have the political will beginning with Wilberforce, 21 years old, going into Parliament, fighting this battle, but also big figures of Victorian mainstream political thought like Palmerston, threatening to throw in the gunboats if Brazil didn't stop the slave trade. So there was a genuine political will there. And if we come back to what we were talking about in the earlier seminar, that we had this need to balance the strategy that was being pursued to make it congruent with an external environment, and that strategy depended on a congruence between not just the economic and the technological, but was also going to be influenced by the morals, the sense of justice, the feelings of the society, by the political feasibility, by the regulatory conditions, by the behaviour. What we can see with slavery is, in the 1700s, the political will was fairly neutral, it wasn't very active. Most of the arguments were pro-slavery. But over a period of time, into the 1800s, first, societal attitude changed. Like I say, the emergence, the vibrancy that existed around free market capitalism. More slowly, behaviour changed. It didn't become positive necessarily, but it became neutral. People did not lose their sugar or their tea or their coffee because the slave trade ended. There were alternatives put into place. And so behaviour became neutral. The technology became supportive of the change. The political movement shifted slightly more slowly, but again began to accept the new norms, the new common sense. The regulatory environment followed, and the economic environment didn't really it wasn't an active driving force in that change, but the change was eventually accommodated into the economic environmental framework, despite where it originally started, as seeming incongruent that you would have a change in the slave trade while it remained this huge economically viable system. Where does that leave us in terms of where we are today? What are the lessons we take from the slave trade, and rather, kind of almost incongruously itself, apply that to climate change?
Thank you, Mick.
Do you want me to swap it over?
Oh yeah, great, thank you. Okay, so in terms of lessons, you clearly got to be pretty cautious about something as complex as this. But a thesis is that congruence theory applies, that stuff likes to be congruent, that the tall poppy gets chopped off, that either the elements of the pestle will converge around the new system, or those that have attempted to converge, but if they do not bring the majority of the system with them, will converge back. And that ultimately they will tend towards convergent systems. A second thought you might have is diminishing marginal returns. What moves first? Well, maybe it's the stuff that's easiest to move that moves first. Another thought you might have is tipping points. That within this set, while it's an interdependent, an interconnected set of systemic elements, there will be those that are both highly incongruent and highly influential. And those highly influential, highly incongruent, standout, game changer elements will determine success in your pathway to synergy. And that to get those highly incongruent, highly influential elements in place, just as in the slave trade, where there was a segmentation of the potential blockers, the owners remaining on side, while those who are trading, having their business curtailed. And again, over time, a segmentation, not immediately phased in. And again, geographically. So one of the questions we're going to be looking at is whether there is a task that successful transformations face, which is to manage to find ways to overcome the economic incumbents and the power that they've got to block change, and whether part of that process is to come up with alternatives for the economic incumbents that appear palatable, that are choosable by them. At which point they come on board, at which point you may move towards recognised synergy and then into maturation. What we're going to look at now is where we are. If these are the elements of the system that we need to have congruent with a new shift in the external environment, which is a carbon-constrained universe, where do we stand? So what I'd like you to do is do it like a la carte menu. With a neighbour, pick any one of those that you want down the bottom. It'll be done on a first-come, first-served basis. Any one of those if you want, political, technological, economic, regulatory, behavioural, societal. With a neighbour, pick any one you want and just map where you reckon we are as a global economy, okay? In other words, take these and place them in one of three boxes. Either our political climate is fully congruent with a carbon-constrained universe, or you might want to say it's way out there on a limb, okay? That's the task. Take a neighbour or two, take a couple of minutes, and place where you reckon we are. All right, let's take any one of these. Who, first of all, has got any thoughts on political? Where are we going to place political? Come on, where are we going to go with political?
Well, I was arguing that political often falls into places long after reformers or the others have moved. But then we were discussing whether anything political had anything that had relevance to the political dimension had moved already on climate change. And I was just suggesting that actually we were seeing this in some of the refugee movements and the wars in the Sahara.
Yes.
And in the climate-induced catastrophes,
Yes.
floods in Bengal. These are going to feed their way into political solutions.
Okay, so potentially some political movement, but within less politically empowered parts of the economy.
Yes, but the threat to others is beginning to...
I'm not seeing the heads nodding in the room about the threat to the others. All right, but I take your point about the long term. David?
76 nations of the 130 nations signing up to the Accord have submitted carbon reduction programs. These are 85% of global emitters. We can't say political or still out there in the incongruous.
But are these commitments cumulatively adequate and binding?
If you accept the United States, the rest are less.
And China?
China, absolutely.
Australia?
Australia, no. But Indonesia? I think political isn't way out left. I think
All right. And watch this, by the way. Watch this and gasp. We are moving. We're not. This was so promising. Mick and I, we had this so damn tight.
Oh, I know what
it moves. I promise you will have the power to move this.
I know what I did. Yeah. I'm going to move it.
It has the power to move.
I'll move it for you. That will be easier. Okay.
Oh, thank you, Mick. No, you lost it.
Where would you like it?
Well, it seems pretty
Warm,
disputed
warm,
where it
hot.
goes.
Kind of get a circle around here.
Okay, with a direction.
Yeah, you'd like it to be a bit longer, wouldn't you?
All right. The technologies. Where are they? Please.
We just had some thoughts that in the so-called developing world, the technology is more or less, adequate or becoming adequate to develop these poorer countries.
Yeah.
The minimum amount of technology that's already available would make a huge difference.
If we started to decarbonise according to those commitments, would we need new technologies that do not yet exist?
Still need some.
There's an awful lot there.
But we're not completely.
But we're talking about scaling up CCS. We're talking about maybe investing in stuff like CSB. In the end, it's something that we're pretty confident that we got the technologies to deal with.
I like where it is.
Excellent. On the economic side.
We looked at technology
Yeah.
and came to
Yeah.
a similar conclusion.
Okay. On the economics. On the economics, where are we?
At the moment, it's incongruous.
Yep. Yep. On the regulatory. Touching neutral. Touching neutral. I mean, you could look at Copenhagen as being the chance to have got a little more neutral. Pushing out, out, not neutral, out.
Good.
On the behavioural.
Depends whereabouts in the world you are.
Yes.
America is distinctly incongruent.
Yes. And one of the things we were just talking about with Martin and Jeremy is the sort of phenomenon of pseudo-congruence. This is the Mitchell and Webb clip, that we engage in behaviours that give us the ritualistic behaviours that give us the impression of congruence. And on the societal side, our mores, our norms.
Neutral.
Because everyone's talking about it, aren't they? In the developed world, but whether they're doing anything talk's cheap. Exactly.
Talk is
so it's
cheap.
kind of, it's not congruent.
Talk is cheap.
Yeah, it's kind of neutral.
I don't think there's also with the slave example, because there is this kind of direct parallel, an impending kind of personal thing that says this must change.
Yep.
It's also a little bit more ideological
Yeah, yeah.
So, yeah, a lot of talk, maybe not yet,
Okay, but potentially neutral, a new category. Okay.
Oops, I just lost it.
That's what happens.
Yes.
So it's pretty consistent with where we've been eyeballing it as well. If we can flick on. Almost exactly consistent, but we segmented the societal. But there's a little bit of a schizophrenia there.
You could do that.
We decided to do that. We just chopped it up. It was great. It felt so good. And yet, which is extraordinary, that we appear not even to be at the point where there is a moral imperative that's consistent. That the first driver that was there for the slave trade doesn't yet appear to be firmly in place. So the question then is, of the different models that we've currently got, of the different pathways forward, what could work? What forms of alternative economic model could manage to bring these babies down into the bottom right-hand corner and be congruent and work, and therefore get accepted, and therefore follow the pathway from frenzy through to synergy and maturation? And what we'd now propose to do is just do a little ride through some of the current ideas that are out there, some of the things that we are being offered.
So, to summarize some of the lessons around transformation, divide them between the conditions and the features. Who knows who this gentleman is?
It's a tough one. It's a really tough one.
Oh God, I hope somebody does, because I can't pronounce his name. Dave, you've got to know who he is. Oh gosh. Ilya Prigogine? Prigogine, thank you.
Nick doesn't know. Points.
Yeah, that's why. And sucking on his glasses, looking very. And the reason part of the reason that he is there is because he introduced this this idea that you have tipping points. I mean, to take a step back, economists since the 19th century have loved to ground their theory in the universal truth of physics. There is no reason to believe why economics has a universal truth in the way that physics does, but it makes economists, I know, feel good. Yeah. And more now, with the sort of decline of equilibrium in physics, with the decline of thinking out of Walras and so on, we have economists now latching themselves onto this as a more universal truth, which is complexity theory, the idea of bifurcation happening in society, that this is unpredictable. And this is really part of the transformation, is that it's going into a world of great turbulence and great unknown. It's also, it either takes time. Perez, in the early examples, talks about the maturation of a particular new paradigm taking 40 to 60 years. The example of slavery suggests 100 years. It takes time, or it takes a catastrophe that forces change. So the kind of change that we had with the Marshall Plan after the Second World War, the kind of change that we had with the space race. These were all changes that came out of a sense of catastrophe. And one of the ways I think of looking at climate change at the moment is it is a crisis in search of its catastrophe. And many people say, you know, if only people could see what the effects are on the third world. Well, no, I don't. And even perhaps in the third world, they don't see what it is beyond their doors and so on and so forth. So the conditions for transformation are there. And then the features of transformation also need to be noted, that there is a shift in the external environment, recognition of incongruence, the emergence of early movers, a tipping point. There are a number of features that exist in the examples of transformation that we have that are common, and we are still waiting to emerge in the context of climate change. Some are there, some still need to emerge. So let's take a look. Those of you who were here for the very first seminar will remember we talked about oracles. We talked about the oracles of a low-carbon future, and that they included people like Nick Stern, Nick Branson, Dick Branson, Stephen Hawking, and so on and so forth. So we're going to go back, because we have actually given some thought to these seminars. We're going to come back to those people now. If we look at Branson, he's probably got more in common with Lawson than most people would recognise. Nick Stern has probably got more in common with Lawson than we'd recognise. And somebody like Hu Jintao has, because what they have in common is being wedded to this basic economic model that has dominated the old paradigm of growth. What they are trying to do is to influence consumption, investment, income, goods and services, while leaving the basic engine of growth untouched. We talked about this a bit last week, and the problem is that this beating heart of growth prevents any real meaningful change in these outer conditions. And so we see that despite all the effort that is put into low-carbon energy, renewable energy, and so on and so forth, during this period, since the 1980s, world GDP goes on up, and so does the consumption of coal, combustion carbon dioxide, oil, and natural gas. We come back to this, that for all that upwards movement, we're still meant to be trying to find our way to that trajectory. This was actually brought to our attention by somebody who attended the seminar last week. Biggest IPO in India was the Coal India, oversubscribed by 15 times. Share price rose by 40% on the first day of trading. It's totally about coal. In the whole IPO prospectus, there was no mention of climate change. Biggest IPO in Italy in recent years was of NL Green, which hived off from NL Energy. Undersubscribed. Retail buyers had to come and pick up the rest of the shares at rock bottom prices. The prices collapsed. If you are sitting there in the corporate environment and you are thinking, where are the big opportunities that everybody is talking about? What is it? Is it that suddenly financiers have gone bonkers? Is it that financiers are bonkers and are completely misinterpreting what is going on? Or is it that we really are caught in these kind of incongruences? And we have the Tim Jackson paradox, him talking about how we decouple growth from the use of energy. And his paradox that he points out, which in some ways is similar to the Jevons paradox, that we become more resource efficient. It looks like we decouple emissions from growth, i.e. the carbon intensity goes down. And so that encourages us to keep wanting to try and grow the economy. The idea of that we have decoupled in any meaningful terms seems a fairly spurious argument at the present time, given the current figures. And so, were you going to do this?
I'll take over in a couple. You do your beautiful Bill McKibben picture.
Okay. I'm going to do half of this for reasons that will become apparent. And so one of the other oracles that we talked about in the very first seminar was Bill McKibben and Tim Jackson. Now, for simplicity's sake, we are merging people with somewhat different ideas. They wouldn't necessarily all agree, but there is a sort of common theme here with the King of Thailand, with Vandana Shiva, that we can achieve prosperity without growth, and that it will have these features. So we'll live better rather than just consume more. There'll be reduced consumption because of changing social logic. There will be equality, a sharing of resources across the world. Prosperity should not be measured by GDP but by well-being. And to an extent we saw that with echoing in the current Conservative government, or the coalition government's thinking with its announcement yesterday on wanting indicators of well-being, building on the ideas of Sen and Stiglitz for the French government. This is where Bill McKibben lives. This is a place called Ripton in Vermont. It's quite near where my mother-in-law lives. And it's on a hill, and my claim to fame with Ripton is that I was once driving my daughter up a hill to get her to summer camp, and there was a flash flood, and a cow went past me in the flash flood. So that's my memory of Ripton. You don't forget a cow going past. However, if you really want to know what Ripton is very poor Vermont farmers, average income less than $5,000 a year. This guy looks like a terrible redneck. He's actually killing the deer that will keep him alive and his family alive throughout the winter. It is easy to want that world. The world for most people, on the conditions that McKibben is talking about, is really that person's world. Is it possible? Well, this is our average spend at the moment. Household spend, £471 a week, divided between things like transport, housing, mortgage, etc., etc. And to a degree, it is possible. You can halve that. Tim Jackson says what we need to do is work half the time, and we'll get half the income. And we can do that. It will be a significant change in our lifestyles. And so one of the serious questions is, how willing are we to undergo those changes? And at the same time, how do we actually go through the process of making those changes? Which one are we on? Do you just want me to carry on?
Sure.
Sorry. And I do emphasize that second part, which is, it's not just, are we willing to live in that different world, but how do we get to that world? And we come back to a slide from Seminar 1, where the funds that we're looking to transform into that world are largely pension funds, which are problematic in themselves. People's pensions are being cut back. Pensions are inherently unrisky. You've got rising unemployment. You have a steep decline in the kind of venture capital that is going to fund the entrepreneurs that are required to make that shift in the world. You've got resistance from the incumbent industries, and you've got the fact that a lot of that debt, which underpins our current economy, is owned by the emerging markets. These are the realities of making that transformation. We don't make a point of whether that is possible or not, but we want to point out that these are the realities that you're operating in. And that moves us on to, if you like, the perverse opposite to the McKibben-Jackson prosperity without growth world. A lot of talk about the fortune at the bottom of the pyramid. This is the amount of money at the bottom of the pyramid. It's the world's poorest third, and this is the amount of wealth that they have. This is what Prahalad and others have said companies should aim for. This, by the way, is what America's richest 10% have. Just America, just their richest 10%. That's their share of that particular pie. If you are a company, yes, it's very attractive to make the appeal that you should be serving the poor, but that is one hell of a market that exists in the USA. And that is the thinking behind Plutonomy. That is the thinking behind Ajay Kapoor, who was originally at Citigroup. He's now with a different financial organisation. I've actually forgotten which. And these are the words that he used in his very groundbreaking, disturbing initial report on Plutonomy. Bin John Bling, equality is the biggest threat to companies' growth, because it will actually stop companies focusing on the wealthy. And this is the world that he is talking about. It's a world where this graph is talking about the average income of the top 0.1% of American families compared to the bottom 90%. 1928, before the Great Recession, there was a period here as well, and now you have the wealth owned by the richest is 1,000 times the income of the poorest 90%. And this needs to be taken seriously as a world that could come about as we make this transformation. Disproportionate growth, emphasis on distributive rather than creative economic mode, which we can deal with in questions. Inequality is welcomed as a good thing. And potentially it's less frivolous consumption. I mean, what you don't want is a bunch of up-and-coming working class people buying Hello Kitty stuff. It's part of the argument of wasteful consumption. And so despite the appearance that we talked about in Seminar 1, that there is this equality, you do have this enormous amount of wealth in the hands of a very few people. The richest 1% of adults account for 40% of all household wealth. And stagnant wealth. Part of the reason why Walmart is such a success is because American wages have actually gone down between the start of the Reagan era and today. They've gone down by $72 on average. So Walmart has been able to produce more with less. That is part of the growth model that we have at the moment, is this relentless drive towards greater productivity. And here you have it, South Africa looking very much like America, looking very much like Jakarta. That a world with climate change does not have to be an equal, more just world. It is equally possible to imagine that it is going to be a world of gated communities and greater segmentation. And one last point on that is, here's the FTSE 100 today, and here is the share price of H.R. Owen, the luxury car supplier.
Thank you, Mick.
Cheer them up.
Okay, so Mick's just outlined some of the possible models that are on offer. And what I'd like to do is just highlight the problems that he's identified on the schema that we've been looking at. So if you look at green growth, well, you've got a political problem. How many seats did the Green Party win in the UK? 1. You go on their website, what do they count as a highlight? What percentage threshold of the vote do they count as a highlight? Anyone give me a guess? 4. 4% is a highlight. We have a political system that is not getting a message that this is a vote winner. And when that political system has tried to translate that into economic realities, as Sarkozy did when he proposed a 17 euro a tonne French carbon tax, rising to 100, even though it was in his manifesto, what happened? It got voted out, and there was a lot of political backlash on it. What was the Daily Express's message about the £1 billion that was committed for the Green Investment Bank for 2013? What a waste of money. What a waste of money. What you've got is an economic system that is congruent with the political system, and that economic system is by no means putting in place carbon taxation. It is, on the contrary, offering $340 billion a year of subsidy to fossil fuels. So you've got an economic system that is incongruent as well. In terms of a social system, are the politicians misreading it? Are they? Are they? Or have you got a social system where there is an assumption about what creates utility, and the assumption is that it's consumption that creates utility? In terms of technological, in terms of legal, maybe some glimmers of hope. The technologies are there. There's been, of course, some scaling back with CCS, with the Spanish wind power stories, but the technologies are there. And legal, the beginnings of rays of hope around RED, around other ways of doing this stuff. And, of course, behaviours that are consistent, even if they're not the norm. But if you were to look at this model, you've got some formidable barriers to scaling up. And, nowhere greater than the Copenhagen results last year to illustrate it. In terms of plutonomy, paradoxically, if you were a betting man, this would appear to be the model towards which we will slide most easily. The Joburg model, the Santon model, the gated community. And if you look at prosperity around growth, you again see some formidable barriers. Not the least of which is, again, the interplay between the political and economic. That you've got a national debt system where just to cover the interest rates, just to cover the payments that are required, means growth at the national level. Likewise, at the domestic level, at the household level, to pay off the stuff. That right now, the debate as it's framed is you've got a choice of collapses between economic collapse or environmental collapse. And the prosperity without growth model appears to threaten economic collapse. That's the bit that's going to stick with it. So is there an alternative? Is there a way through this? I'd like to, after giving you a glimpse of the fierce brain of Schumpeter, who of course inspired much of Perez's thinking, show you two pictures from which I think you could construct something of the outlines, the contours of a narrative of hope, which is the narrative we want to explore in the final session. Okay. Anyone know what these two things have got in common? They were both candidates for the last in the 100 objects. And, okay, what's telling about them? Well, on the left you've got Didier Drogba's shirt. So you've got a guy, whatever he is, Francophone, Cote d'Ivoirian, a Vietnamese manufactured T-shirt, Chelsea-owned, a Chinese-owned, Russian-owned company whose support base is the most vigorous in China. So you've got the ultimate icon of globalization. And then you've got the D-Light lamp. And this is the one that's chosen. The lamp. And I think it's an interesting story. And it's one that I just come into contact with a few weeks ago. So if you take power, you've got 500 million people in Africa alone, powerless, because they have no power, and you've got an economic model that deals with that, as we've seen with firewood, with air quality deaths, 2 million a year, with the carbon impacts, 150 million tons, and the poorest of the poor spending 70% of their income on kerosene to find an alternative. What does the current economic model do in response to that unaligned, inefficient way of meeting a market need? Well, it ignores it. It ignores it. Is there a different model? Well, there clearly is a different model, which Delight and Philips and others have come up with, which is to decentralize, to have decentralized energy. And in this case, what you have for the Philips solar lighting plan, similar to these guys, 20, 30 bucks has a 10-fold impact on incomes. Can use it for mobile phone charging, can use it for power, 12 hours of power, and it of course gets rid of the carbon, it of course gets rid of the health impacts. And what it's an illustration of is, I think, something that you could look at as a different form of growth, which is not growth by delivering whatever it takes to create growth, but growth by looking at the megatrends, looking at what the market need is, and then looking at that market as an opportunity to deliver products and services that respond to basic needs. Now, you've got an immediate challenge, which I think everyone in the room will see, which is the moment you do that, the moment you give them mobile phones, the moment you give them power, the moment you multiply their income tenfold, what's going to happen? Well, their carbon emissions are going to go up. Their carbon emissions are going to go up. And you're going to have that waterbed effect, where as you're trying to squeeze the curve down in the West, you realize that actually it's gone up in Bangladesh. It's gone up in Kenya. You're going to have to squeeze it down further somewhere else where it's going to hurt, which might be the US, which might be here in the UK. Which then introduces the question of the linkages between these two competing items. Are they actually dual poles? Are they both potentially part of the solution? And you may not be a football fan, but I think one thing that this shirt also represents, in addition to globalization, is community, is people getting together and getting together for experience, and getting together for experience that ultimately is very often a low-carbon experience, that is about breaking down a model that we attain utility purely by consuming goods and services. So what we want to look at in the last of these seminars is a twin-track approach. Is there a model where we can deliver goods and services that respond to basic needs and therefore create a pathway for growth, but also look at a model of decarbonizing which is framed slightly differently to how it's been framed within the political agenda here, even within the green movement's agenda, which is not an agenda of less, not an agenda of self-flagellation, not an agenda of denial, but actually an agenda on focusing on the things which do deliver happiness, which do deliver to us the things that we care about, which may coincidentally happen to be experiences which are low carbon. Those are some of the topics we are going to be exploring in the final session.